Hello, and welcome to the Actual Tech Media Expert Series session on best practices for managing, monitoring, and securing Active Directory. The Expert Series is where we at Actual Tech Media select a topic that's a major pain point from you and our audience, and we invite an industry expert to give us a closer look. My name is Scott Becker. I'm from Actual Tech Media, and I'm excited to be your moderator for this Active Directory focused event. Now, before we get to today's great content, we do have some housekeeping items that will help you get the most out of this session. First off, we just want to thank our sponsor, CrowdStrike. CrowdStrike recognizes that Active Directory can be the weakest link in your cybersecurity with major implications for ransomware. So they're offering a white paper that you can download by clicking on this slide. You can also find it in the handout section of your webinar control panel. It is a white paper on reducing Active Directory security risks, and it's a great resource. While you're in the handout panel, do want to also point out there are some other links in there. There's one to the Gorilla Guide Book Club, where you can get access to Actual Tech Media's great printed resources on technology topics, as well as a link to the ATM Event Center, which has our calendar of upcoming events. I encourage you to access those resources now and share them with your friends and your colleagues. We do also want this to be an informative event for you, so we encourage any questions in the questions box in our webinar control panel. Not only will we have team members responding to questions during the live event, but we'll also have a dedicated Q&A session at the end of the presentation where we will discuss in greater detail some of the top questions that you ask. That Q&A panel is also the place to let us know about any technical issues you might be experiencing. A browser refresh is going to fix most audio, video, and slide advancement issues, but if that doesn't work, just let us know in the Q&A and we'll provide further technical assistance. Finally, at the end of this webinar, we will be awarding a $300 Amazon gift card to one lucky registrant. Of course, you must be in attendance during the live event to qualify for the prize. The official terms and conditions of today's prize drawing can be found in the handout section. Just scroll to the bottom and you'll find the prize terms and conditions link there. And with that, let's get to today's fantastic content. It's my pleasure to introduce you to our presenter today. We have Brien Posey. Brian's going to tell you a little bit about himself when I turn things over to him. But I'd just like to say I've known Brien for probably 10 years, and he's been a Microsoft MVP for 20 years. So for twice as long as I've known him, he's been earning that Microsoft MVP designation, which is a tough designation to get and really impressive. I've worked with Brien as a writer and a speaker over that time. In addition to being an all-around great guy, he really knows Microsoft. So we're in good hands for this Active Directory session. Brien, welcome to the webcast. Thanks for coming on.
Oh, thanks for having me, and thank you for that intro. That's probably the nicest intro anybody's ever given me. At any rate, I'm serious.
Take it away.
At any rate, the topic of discussion for today is managing, monitoring, and securing Active Directory best practices. Now, as you can imagine, that is a tough thing to fit into a limited amount of time because Active Directory is a massive, massive topic. But my goal here is to cut through the clutter and give you some really actionable things that you can take back and put into practice today. So that's kind of where we're headed with this. So just a couple of words about me. I'm a freelance technology writer and speaker. I'm also a 20-time Microsoft MVP, as Scott mentioned. And for the last 7 years, I've also been training as a commercial astronaut candidate in preparation for a mission to study polar mesospheric clouds from space. So let's go ahead and get into the presentation. Now, before you can really talk about Active Directory security, I think it's really important to take a moment and talk about what the threats are to Active Directory. In other words, what is it that the attackers are really trying to accomplish, and how are they going about doing that? Well, there are two main approaches that attackers use, and these are super, super high level. But those approaches can be categorized as checklists and graphs. Now, these aren't necessarily official terms. There's probably a million different terms for both of these. These are just the terms I've decided to go with. Checklists are one of those things that tend to be really familiar to IT pros. It's the sort of thing that's used in penetration testing. And we've all seen them, even if we've never done a penetration test. Because pretty much every tech writer out there, including myself, I know I'm guilty of this, has written articles at one time or another. Here's 10 things that you can do to improve your security. And if you do these 10 things, boy, are you going to be secure. That's the essence of a checklist. From an attack standpoint, attackers also use checklists, similar to the way that penetration testers use them. They'll have a list of potential vulnerabilities. They'll go through that list one by one and see if any of those vulnerabilities are left open so that they can get into your system that way. That's the essence of a checklist attack. Now, a graph attack is a little bit different, and I'm not really sure that graph is the best term, but that's what I'm going to go with for the purposes of this presentation. A graph-based attack might be described as an objective-based attack. In other words, the attacker has figured out some way into the system. That kind of happens before the attack ever starts. They assess their situation, and then they arrive at a starting point. They also know what it is that they ultimately want to accomplish in their attack against your Active Directory, and they define that as an ending point. So once they've got that starting point and that ending point defined, the only thing left to do is to figure out steps that they can take to go from point A to point B. That's the essence of a graph-based attack. Now, admittedly, there is some overlap between the two. For example, an attacker might start with a checklist attack and use that as an initial point of entry, and then move on to a graph-based attack from there. So what are some examples? Well, with checklist attacks, like I said, these are super common. They're things that we've all seen a million times, but I wanted to throw out at least one example. Back in November, Microsoft, on their Patch Tuesday, released a series of patches that were meant to address two vulnerabilities. And these two vulnerabilities, and I'll read directly from the Microsoft website here, when combining these two vulnerabilities, an attacker can create a straightforward path to a domain admin user in Active Directory environment that hasn't applied these updates. According to the security alert, this escalation attack allows attackers to easily elevate their privileges to that of a domain admin once they compromise a regular user in the domain. So in other words, a vulnerability existed where an attacker could come in, compromise a basic user, and then elevate their privileges to that of a domain admin. And Microsoft released some patches that were designed to correct the two vulnerabilities that allowed that to happen. So that's an example of a checklist item. An attacker would likely know that those vulnerabilities existed at one time, and they might check to see if those vulnerabilities have been patched on a potential victim's system. Now, what about a graph-based attack? Well, when it comes to a graph-based attack, that's something that's a little bit more difficult to provide an example of. But one thing that I will tell you is that attackers generally prefer a graph-based attack if they can use it. And the reason for that is really simple. Think about what I just told you a moment ago about the elevation of privileges vulnerability that existed in Active Directory prior to the November patch release. Well, there's a big difference between a vulnerability and an exploit. Just because a vulnerability exists doesn't mean that someone knows how to exploit that vulnerability to get what it is that they want. So there's quite a bit of work that an attacker has to do in order to figure out how to exploit a vulnerability in a meaningful way. So they put all of this work in, and then Microsoft or whoever we happen to be talking about releases a patch, and all of a sudden that vulnerability goes away. Well, that's a big problem for an attacker because they've put in all of this work, and all of a sudden it's meaningless. They can't do anything with it unless somebody is neglectful in their patch management strategy. So the attackers know that they've got a very limited amount of time from the time that a vulnerability is discovered until that vulnerability is going to go away. The same thing doesn't hold true with graph-based attacks. With a graph-based attack, it's going to be unique for every situation, and an attacker isn't necessarily counting on the existence of a vulnerability that might be patched one day. So that's why graph-based attacks tend to be preferable. So how do you prevent a graph-based attack from happening? Well, there are any number of things that you can do. The first thing is adhere to Microsoft's best practices. That's the absolute number one thing that you can and should do to prevent these types of attacks. And I've only got a limited amount of time to talk, so I don't really have time to go into every one of those best practices. But there is a hyperlink on the slide that you can use to go to Microsoft's best practices list for Active Directory security. And I would recommend giving that a thorough read and seeing if there are things that you can apply to your own organization to tighten your security. Another thing that you can do is to look for general weaknesses in your Active Directory environment. And this is one of those things that is sometimes a hard truth to swallow. Here's why this is so important. Active Directory has extreme longevity. If you think about it, Active Directory dates all the way back to Windows 2000. That's when it was introduced, and that came out in 1999. But even before that, the concept of a domain existed in Windows NT Server, and that came about back in 1994. So imagine a company that has been using Windows from the very beginning. We're talking about a company that's been around for decades. So they deploy Windows NT maybe 3.5.1 back in the 90s. They implement a domain, and back then documentation wasn't what it is today. So a lot of the best practices didn't exist back then. The documentation was a little sketchy, to say the least. So maybe they implemented it and didn't fully appreciate the consequences of all the configuration items that they were putting into place. The problem with that is that a lot of that never truly goes away, because that company at some point likely did a migration to Windows 2000. And then maybe they migrated to Server 2003, and so on and so forth. And even if this particular organization can't trace its roots all the way back to Windows NT, they likely implemented the Active Directory at some point along the way with a previous version of Windows Server. And the basic structure of their Active Directory and any permissions that they put in place back at the very beginning, at least some of those are likely to still exist. And if the organization didn't fully appreciate Active Directory back then and didn't have a firm concept of how it works and what the implications were of various actions, there could be permissions lurking in the Active Directory to this day that would give an attacker permissions that they really shouldn't have. So that would be the number one piece of advice that I would give you, is to take a really hard look at the permissions that exist in your Active Directory and be on the lookout for anything that might be lingering from days long gone. Now, as I mentioned a moment ago, when an attacker is going to perform one of these graph attacks, they're going to have to initially breach the system. They're going to have to get in somehow before they can even begin the attack. So how does that happen? Well, there are any number of ways that an attacker can get in, but Microsoft lists some of the top ways. And again, I've provided a hyperlink to the source at the bottom of the slide in case you want to check this out for yourself. But some of the more common initial breach targets include gaps in antivirus and anti-malware deployments, incomplete patching, outdated applications and operating systems. And that's a big one, because even if you've stayed up to date with hardening Windows Server and keeping everything patched and all that, if you've got an outdated application that contains a vulnerability, well, that application has to have some sort of permissions in order to run. And if an attacker can compromise that application, then they're going to inherit the same permissions that that application has and be able to get into your system that way. Misconfiguration, that's another one. Disabling security features. I'm sure at some point in time, most of us have probably done that, because that's the only way to get something to work, is by disabling a security feature. And maybe that sort of thing could have slid by in the past, but that's one of those things that really isn't acceptable anymore, just because attacks have become so much more sophisticated over time. Allowing users to install unauthorized applications, have them having the permission to be able to do that. Those are just a few of the initial breach targets that attackers generally favor. Now, when it comes to Active Directory breaches, Microsoft provided some statistics. Now, these statistics are a few years old, but I found them interesting nonetheless, because according to Microsoft, and I believe they got their data from the Verizon Data Breach Investigation Report, they said that 98% of data breaches stem from external agents. So in the vast majority of cases, you don't have bad actors who have infiltrated the company and are working as employees attacking the system. It's coming in from the outside. Then they go on to say that 85% of data breaches took weeks or more to discover. 92% of incidents were discovered by a third party. So in other words, an organization was attacked and they don't even know it. They end up bringing in some consultant to do something totally unrelated, and that consultant ends up being the one who finds the breach in 92% of the cases. So that one just blew me away. And then the last one, 97% of breaches were avoidable through simple or intermediate controls. That's huge. A statement from Microsoft saying that 97% of these breaches that occurred could have been avoided if the organization had just put in some simple or intermediate controls that would have prevented them. So one of the most important things that you can do is to focus on your Active Directory auditing strategy. The basic idea behind auditing, for anybody who might not be familiar with it, is that there are certain events that occur as a part of normal Active Directory operations. And when those events occur, they can be written to an event log so that you've got a record of the event. So a couple of things that came from the Microsoft article that is linked at the bottom of the slide. The apparent ineffectiveness of event monitoring and log analysis continues to be somewhat of an enigma. The opportunity for detection is there. Investigators noted that 66% of victims had sufficient evidence available within their logs to discover the breach had they been more diligent in analyzing such resources. And then they go on to say that the lack of monitoring Active Directory logs remains a consistent weakness in many companies. Security defense plans. The 2012, so again, this is an older one, but I believe that the concept is still relevant. The 2012 Verizon Data Breach Report found that even though 85% of breaches took several weeks to be noticed, 84% of victims had evidence of the breach in their logs. So in other words, organizations aren't really noticing when breaches happen, and the main reason why they're not noticing this is because they're not being proactive in reviewing their logs. Because in the majority of these cases that were cited, evidence of the breach did exist in the log files, and had these organizations taken the time to go through those logs, then they would have found the breach much, much sooner than the weeks or months that it ultimately ended up taking them. So let's talk a little bit about auditing the Active Directory, because this is important. Now, when it comes to auditing the Active Directory, there are two ways of doing this. You can use legacy auditing, or you can use advanced auditing, which was introduced with Windows Vista and Windows Server 2008. Today, advanced auditing should be the only one that you're using, but even if you have a logistical requirement that requires you to use legacy auditing, there's nothing wrong with legacy auditing. It can still be used, it's still effective, and it's certainly better than not using anything. So just to take a quick look at what this looks like, here's legacy auditing. It's implemented through group policy settings, and you would go to computer configuration, computer configuration policies, Windows setting, security settings, local policies, and audit policy. So that's where the settings are found. And you can see what those settings look like right here. There's maybe about a dozen settings. I haven't actually counted them. And for each one of these, you can audit success and or failure of those items. So for example, audit account logon events. If someone successfully logs on and a success audit is enabled, then you would end up with an entry in your event logs related to that logon event. Now, advanced auditing is also set up through group policy, but it's done in a slightly different location. You would go to computer configuration, policies, Windows settings, security settings, but instead of going to local policies, you would go to advanced audit policy configuration and audit policies. And here's what that looks like. So we still have an account logon option, but when you select that, instead of simply seeing the box that allows you to turn on success and or failure auditing, you have a number of subcategories. In this case, we have things like audit credential validation, audit Kerberos authentication service, audit Kerberos service ticket operations, and audit other account logon events. So you can turn those on and off individually. The idea behind being able to do that is that there are certain events that are really telling with regard to Active Directory security. There are other events that just take up space within your audit logs. And while there's not really anything wrong with taking up space, having that extra clutter in your logs can make it more difficult to find what it is that you're really looking for. And this can be especially true if you're using a service that notifies you of various types of log entries. If you have a lot of noise entries in there, you can end up with a lot of alerts that are more or less meaningless, and then you can end up in a situation where alert fatigue creeps in and you're getting so many alerts that nobody pays a bit of attention to them anymore, which is just as bad as not having any auditing at all. So just a quick comparison between the two. The dialog box in the upper portion of the screen shows the legacy auditing in the group policy. So you can see that we have audit account logon events currently set to not defined. And then with the advanced auditing in the lower part of the screen, we have account logon, which is comparable to the audit account logon events shown in the legacy auditing. But with account logon selected, we have several subcategories that are not displayed in the legacy auditing. So this raises the question of how do you find out what types of subcategories are available? You know, here we have 4 that are shown, which doesn't seem like a huge number, but there are a lot more that are related to other categories of auditing. So how do you see that? Well, the easiest thing is to fire up PowerShell in an elevated session and use the audit pol command. That's audit AUDIT pol POL. You can see what that looks like at the very top of the screen, and you'll want to use the /list parameter and the /subcategory : * parameter. And when you do that, what you'll end up with is a comprehensive list of all of the categories and subcategories that exist for auditing. So you can see that we have things like in log on, log off, we have log on, log off, account lockout, IPsec main mode, and the list goes on and on. So we have all of these individual categories and subcategories that we can audit. Now, one thing that I wanted to be sure and point out is that there's a Microsoft Knowledge Base article, and again, I've provided the source, that says group policy does not always accurately report the status of all enabled auditing policies, whereas auditpol.exe does. See Getting Effective Audit Policy in Windows 7 and 2008 R2 for more details. Now again, that's citing a really old version of Windows that's not even supported anymore and hopefully nobody's still using. But the reason why I wanted to include this is because if you look at the other box of text that's on the screen, there's a big black arrow pointing to a date. And this date is less than a year ago. And that shows the date that this article was most recently updated. So presumably this is still an issue even in newer versions of Windows. I'm honestly not sure one way or the other if it is still an issue, but I wanted to include it just in case it is, so that it's something that you would be aware of. So being that Active Directory might not necessarily show you a true picture of your audit policies, an alternative is just to use PowerShell and to use the auditpol command again. So here you can see I typed auditpol and then I used the get switch and the /category : * switch. And what that does is it shows you all of those same categories and subcategories that you saw earlier, but the list shows you your auditing for every single one of those. So if we look back at the log on, log off category, you can see that we're auditing success and failure for log on events, but only auditing success for log off events, which in all fairness, it's really rare for a log off to fail. So there probably isn't a lot of reason to audit log off or failures of log off events. And then we have success auditing for account lockout, no auditing for IPsec main mode, quick mode, or extended mode. But at any rate, what you're seeing right here is a picture of the current audit settings. And incidentally, in case anybody's wondering, the settings that you're seeing on the screen right now don't necessarily reflect best practices. These are default values. So in preparation for this event, I created a Server 2022 virtual machine and I fired up PowerShell, ran this command, and this is what I got. So these are default values. Now, when it comes to advanced auditing, there are a couple of gotchas to be aware of. Now, the screen capture that you see came directly from the group policy editor. And Microsoft says to prevent the legacy traditional category policy from overriding audit policy subcategories, you must enable the force audit policy subcategory setting in Windows Vista or later to override audit policy category settings, policy setting located under computer configuration, Windows settings, security settings, local policies, and security options. So in other words, you're going to have to be sure and force this policy setting in order for it to work. Now, a more important gotcha that I wanted to be sure and mention is that according to Microsoft, if you start enabling anything in advanced audit policy, it's going to take effect immediately, even if you don't click apply. And any pre-existing legacy audit policies are going to be overwritten at that point, and the new policy will start being used. Now, that in itself is worth paying attention to, but if you look at that last sentence, this is the really important part. Because what this is essentially saying is that if you go into the group policy settings and you go into the advanced audit policy and you start playing around with it, you click a few things and then you're like, well, I'm not actually ready to turn this on, so you turn them back off. At that point, you will have completely disabled auditing altogether, because the advanced audit settings that you turned on and then turned back off won't be in effect because you turned them off. But at the same time, the legacy policy settings won't be in effect anymore either, because the simple fact that you initially turned on those advanced settings will disable those legacy settings. So that's something really important to be aware of if you're using legacy audit policy settings. So the audit logs, I don't want to spend too much time on this because there's still a lot of material that I want to get to. But for anybody who's not familiar with the Windows Event Viewer, this is what it looks like. And this is where you find those log entries that I've been talking about. So you fire up Event Viewer by typing event vwr.msc at the Windows Run prompt. It'll take you to this console right here. And then just go in and expand Windows Logs and select Security, and you'll see all of those security logs. And what you see in the dialog box in the foreground is an example of an account log-off event. So you see various details of that event, such as when it happened, whether the event was successful or a failure, and so on and so forth. Now, incidentally, there are a couple of other audit logs that aren't directly related to the types of events that I've been talking about that you should be paying attention to. And you can see two black arrows on the left half of the screen that are pointing to the location of these logs. One is the directory service log. And the directory service log doesn't focus quite so much on security as it does on Active Directory health. It kind of shows you what's going on with the internal workings of the Active Directory. So that's probably something that you would want to pay attention to if you're concerned about Active Directory security and health. And then the other one is just below that, DNS server. And the reason for that is because DNS is absolutely crucial to the functioning of Active Directory. So if your DNS server is not healthy, your Active Directory is not going to be healthy either. And there are a number of exploits that actually target DNS servers. So it's a good idea just to kind of keep an eye on your DNS logs as well, so that you can get a sense of what may or may not be happening with your Active Directory environment. So what about some best practices? Because that was, after all, the whole point of this presentation was to talk about some best practices. Well, the first best practice on the list is something that I talked about back at the very beginning, is to revisit your Active Directory permissions, since there's a chance that you may have legacy permissions that were put into place at the very beginning that maybe shouldn't be there. Another recommendation would be to make sure that there are a relatively low number of user accounts associated with any group that has privileged access. Because in the vast majority of cases, and certainly in every case that I've ever personally seen, there generally isn't any reason to have a large number of people have privileged access. You want to keep that as minimal as you possibly can. Another best practice is to make sure that you're adhering to the concept of least privileged access, especially when it comes to admins. And when we talk about least privileged access, a lot of times the idea is that users need to have the bare minimum permissions that they require in order to do their job and nothing more. And certainly that is a best practice, but it can and should be extended to admins as well. Because remember, if an admin account is compromised, then the attacker is going to inherit that admin's permissions. So if that admin account doesn't have permission to a certain thing, then the attacker can't get to that certain thing through that account. They would have to find another way. And certainly I would recommend using role-based access control wherever appropriate. Another best practice is to take some time and delve into your service accounts. Now, I know this seems like a really weird thing to talk about in the concept of Active Directory security, but there is a method to the madness here. Remember what I said earlier about that a lot of organizations started implementing Active Directory way back when. And the thing about that is the best practices have evolved considerably over time as technology has improved and as Active Directory has gained maturity, and Microsoft has gotten a better handle on Active Directory operations and what really works at scale and what doesn't. Well, one of those best practices that has radically changed from when Active Directory was first introduced was that of service accounts. Because back then, a service account was really nothing more than just a user account that had permissions to access whatever it was that that service account needed to do. And in almost every case, the service account had at least some form of elevated privileges. Maybe it didn't have full admin permissions, although there certainly were examples of service accounts that did. But a service account typically had more permissions than just a general user. So the best practice would be to go back and review all of those service accounts and make sure, for starters, that you're not using the same service account for multiple applications. Because if you are, what you can end up with is an accumulation of privileges, where one application gives the service account a couple of permissions that it needs, another application adds on a couple of more permissions, so you end up with this account that has a huge number of permissions associated with it that are far more than any one application needs. But really, as a best practice, you should be using built-in service accounts if at all possible. Now, I'll be the first to admit that there are some applications out there that just don't work with built-in service accounts, and that's fine, but that should be the exception rather than the rule. And one more thing that I will throw in is that interactive logons should be denied for service accounts unless it's absolutely necessary, because you never want to end up in a situation where an attacker can compromise a service account, which has some level of elevated privileges, and then log on with that service account and begin attacking your system. And I would also recommend removing old service accounts as a formal part of the application retirement process. So when you deprovision an old application, check and see if there's a service account that that application is using and deprovision that service account as well. So the last topic of discussion that I want to get into with this presentation is that of Active Directory performance. Because as important as it is to keep Active Directory secure, it's equally important to make sure that Active Directory is healthy and that it's performing well. Generally, Active Directory works pretty well on its own. It's a mature technology. As I said earlier, it's been around since the days of Windows 2000, so Microsoft's had a lot of time to fine-tune Active Directory and really get it right. And I think they've done a great job with it. But there are things that can creep in that can cause Active Directory not to perform as well as it should. So I want to spend the last few minutes talking about what some of those things may be. So one of the things that you can do to address Active Directory performance problems is look at the proximity of domain controllers to your users. This is particularly true if you have users that are working in remote locations or branch offices or things like that. If at all possible, if you've got users working in a branch office, put a read-only domain controller in that branch office so that way users aren't having to pass over a WAN link in order to authenticate or to perform other types of Active Directory queries. Another thing, and I mentioned this a little while ago, is to make sure that your DNS servers are healthy, because Active Directory can't function without DNS. And if you're having health issues with DNS, or if your DNS servers aren't performing all that well, then Active Directory performance is probably also going to suffer. Another thing that you should take a look at is how your domain controllers are configured. Make sure that your domain controllers are set up to only act as domain controllers, nothing more, nothing less. The one exception to that is that in smaller organizations, it's fairly common and fully permissible to have the domain services and DNS running on the same machine. That's a pretty normal thing, but you certainly don't want to be installing any additional server roles on your domain controllers or any supplementary software that you don't have to, aside from maybe like a backup agent or anti-malware software. That's kind of the extent of it. And that's not only a performance issue, that's also a security issue, because you want to make sure that you minimize the attack footprint on those servers to the greatest extent possible. So what else can cause Active Directory performance problems? Another thing is network congestion, because if your network's slow, then that can cause replication issues between domain controllers. Another thing, and this is a weird one, but network time, because remember, Active Directory uses the Kerberos protocol. Kerberos is sensitive to the time. So if you have clocks that are out of sync, it can cause all kinds of strange issues with your Active Directory environment. And then the biggest one that I've seen in the real world is resource starvation, particularly on virtual machines, because what happens is organizations adopt a virtualization platform, whether that's Hyper-V, VMware, or something else, and they seek to maximize return on investment by making the best possible use, the most efficient possible use of the hardware resources on that virtualization host. But there's a very fine line between getting the biggest bang for your buck and starving your virtual machines of resources. And unfortunately, a lot of organizations are under budget pressure, and they tend to stretch those hardware resources just a little too far. So you've got to make sure that your domain controllers have the resources that they need in order to function well. So what are some of Microsoft's recommendations? Well, the biggest one is that when you set up a domain controller, if at all possible, and this isn't always possible depending on the size of the Active Directory environment, but if possible, put enough RAM in the virtual machine or the physical machine, whatever it happens to be, in order to load the entire Active Directory database into memory, because that will dramatically improve the performance of your domain controller. If you're not able to do that, then what Microsoft recommends doing is putting the operating system, the logs, and the databases each on separate volumes. So that way everything is isolated from each other and you don't have storage I/O traffic related to your operating system taking away from the volume where the Active Directory database is actually being stored. Another thing to keep in mind is that the Active Directory database cache is read optimized. So in other words, Microsoft expects that there's going to be a lot of read traffic directed at your domain controllers, and in most cases there probably is. One of the estimates that I read, and I'm not sure if this is current or not, but one of the white papers that I had read said that Microsoft generally estimates that 90% of the traffic going to the Active Directory database is read traffic, and that only 10% is write, which kind of makes sense for most of the environments that I've seen in real life. But having said that, that also means that if you're in a write-heavy environment, that the default configuration probably isn't going to be the most suitable for that. So you're going to need to take a look at what you can do to improve the performance of that write traffic. And there are any number of things that you can do. One thing that you can do is to use hardware RAID for inbound traffic to improve overall performance. You can use read and write caching. There are a number of things that you can do to optimize write performance. Another couple of recommendations from Microsoft is don't overtax the processor. Make sure that you've got those CPU resources that you need available to the Active Directory's domain controllers, and avoid overloading the network adapter. So one last thing that I want to talk about is that you can use the performance monitor to track the performance of your domain controllers to make sure that they're performing to the extent that they're supposed to. So if, for example, you find that everybody's complaining about logons being slow and your Active Directory seems sluggish, you can fire up the performance monitor and see what's really going on. And if the performance monitor tells you, hey, everything's great, then you know that the problem's not related to your domain controllers more than likely. You've probably got a problem on your network or somewhere else in your environment. Conversely, if the performance monitor is showing that your domain controller is starved of resources, well, then it points directly to what you need to do in order to fix the problem. Maybe you need to add some memory or allocate a couple more CPU cores or something like that. Now, when it comes to using the performance monitor, for anybody who's not familiar with it, the performance monitor is based on counters. If I can flip back to the previous slide for a second, you can see an example of a counter on this slide. Down at the bottom, there's a counter called percentage of processor time. That particular counter is one of the default counters, and it shows what percentage of time the CPU is in use. And this particular domain controller that I took the screenshot from is basically running at idle in a lab environment. So the percentage of processor time is hovering right around 0, which I would absolutely expect. But this isn't the only counter available. There are a huge number of counters that are baked into the Windows Server operating system, and you can use each one of those counters to monitor various aspects of system performance. Some of these counters are super common, others are really obscure, but Microsoft provides a few counters that are particularly useful when it comes to troubleshooting the performance of a domain controller. So for example, Microsoft says that the database reads average latency should be less than 15 milliseconds. The number of database reads per second should be less than 10. The average latency of log writes should be less than 10 milliseconds. And again, I've provided a link at the bottom of the slide that you can use to go back and get these. And then there are just a couple of more. The total processor utilization, which is the counter that you saw a moment ago, or I think I showed you the percentage processor time, but the percentage of processor utilization should be less than 60%. And then Microsoft also recommends that you use the compare network interface bytes per second or bytes sent per second with the network interface current bandwidth performance counter, and that ratio should be less than 60% utilized. So those are just a few performance monitor counters that you can look at if you're experiencing Active Directory performance problems. So with that, I think we've got just a few minutes left, so I want to go ahead and open it up for any questions that anybody might have.
All right, great. Hey, thanks for that presentation, Brian. That was great. Also, I always like to see the references to Windows NT. That takes me back as well.
Oh yeah.
But Active Directory has been around for a long time. I mean, that technology is long in the tooth.
Yeah, it really is. And I think that's one of those things that people don't really stop to think about, is that it's been around absolutely forever, and that there could be those legacy components that are still around, even if they're running modern operating systems.
Yeah. Well, and also one thing that I really appreciate about this presentation, Brian, is that you created sort of a treasure map to some hidden gems of different support documents from Microsoft. We were just talking about it being a 20-year-old technology, but there's these documents that have been updated, in the last year, full of great information. And I do want to point out in the links in the chat. we did have some questions about slides or links. You'll see in response to a question from Greg that I posted a bunch of Brian's security links under that. So you can grab those there if you didn't capture them during the presentation. And then also I put in another question just to include two other links as well. The one about the magic, the auditing is magic link, which is a great URL. And the one about the hardware consideration. So Brian, thanks for including all those great links. And I just want to make sure that everybody spots those there in the Q&A portion. So we did have a question from Jay Nall who's asking, what free Active Directory audit log program can I use? And do you have any open source recommendations? Any tools that you're aware of?
As far as free, I know that there are a million of them out there. I can't really think of one off the top of my head. I tend to gravitate either toward the Microsoft solutions, or I've on occasion scripted them myself through PowerShell. I know that there are plenty of others that are available. I think I saw some out on GitHub, but I can't really think of the name of them.
Okay, all right. And everybody keep those questions coming. We've got a lot rolling in here. Brian says this was a great presentation. Thank you all. And that's not Brien Posey. That's a different Brian.
Thank you so much.
Let's see. Here's one from Larry, and this is kind of a philosophical question for you, Brian. He says there are a lot of great third-party tools to help secure AD. Do you recommend using third-party apps or sticking with Microsoft tools?
There are a couple of different ways that you could look at that one. I tend to like the third-party route because I'm trying to be really careful about what I'm saying here, but as you mentioned at the very beginning, I've been a Microsoft MVP for 20 years now. Being an MVP, you have access to certain internals at Microsoft. And one of the philosophies, I'm not sure it's still this way, but at least at one time, was that Microsoft assumed that there would be third parties that come in and augment what they've done to provide additional functionality. So I know for a fact that at certain points during the development cycle, various features were omitted because there was an assumption that a third party was going to build it anyway. So I guess all of that is to say that you're probably going to get a better overall experience using maybe not just any third-party solution, but the right third-party solution, if that makes sense.
Okay. Yep, that does. And thanks, Larry, for that question. Next question comes from David. He's wondering, is tombstoning DNS records still recommended? He says he has it set, but my records never seem to clear up after a computer account is deleted when a PC is removed from the domain. Any thoughts on that one?
Let me just answer that by saying I haven't seen anything recently that would suggest that that's changed. But I'm kind of like you. I'm kind of questioning the benefit of doing that.
Okay, super. More thanks from Rob and Tom, for the great information and the links and sharing all your knowledge. One here from Jackie, who's saying, we still run a lot of older computers with Windows XP, but most have been updated to Windows 10. Is it the same process for both older and newer Windows?
Is there any clarification on that? Is what the same process is?
I think that's actually an update process, which is now that I think about it, is a little bit off the AD topic, but I know you do a lot with Windows generally. Any thoughts on, is Windows XP being out of support? Does it require extra steps like interim updates to something else before you can go to 10?
It has been so long since I've updated it from a Windows 10 or excuse me, a Windows XP machine. I'm really not sure.
Fair enough.
To give you an idea how long it's been, the other day I was working on something unrelated and I tried to install Windows XP on Hyper-V on a Server 2022 machine and I couldn't get it to go. I was really shocked. Like, XP shouldn't be that old. Oh, wait. Yes, it is.
A couple of questions and comments about Azure AD. Jason is wondering, would Azure AD be secured similarly to on-premises Active Directory? Any thoughts on that?
Yeah, a lot of the same basic concepts apply to Azure AD. Two things that I will throw out there really quickly is one, if you're using Azure AD, and I'm assuming that you've also got an on-premises Active Directory environment by the nature of the question, you're probably using Azure AD Connect to synchronize the two. So two things I would put out there about Azure AD Connect is one, make sure that you're securing your Azure AD Connect machine to the same extent that you're securing your domain controllers. And that's not my recommendation, that's Microsoft's, because your Azure AD Connect machine has some really sensitive information and it does tend to be a favorite target for attack. The other recommendation is if you've got privileged accounts that are only servicing on-premises environment or on-premises resources, make sure that Azure AD Connect is set up so that you're not synchronizing those accounts up to Azure AD, because there's really no reason to have those accounts in the cloud if they're not doing anything in the cloud. That's one of those things that can kind of come back to bite you.
Okay. All right. A lot of great questions still rolling in. Sonny has another one about Azure AD, wondering if the auditing options apply to Azure AD or if that's a completely separate process and set of considerations.
You know, that's actually a really good question. And off the top of my head, I'm not sure. I could take a guess, but I don't want to give you bad information.
Good, good. No, that makes sense. Uh, Question from Paul. To what extent could implementing AD monitoring and auditing solutions with automated functionality address some of the vulnerabilities that humans can sometimes miss, especially with smaller businesses in mind that may not have the staff to cover these needs?
Oh, I would say that that would go a huge way toward preventing some of those vulnerabilities that, or some of the attacks that get missed. Because going back to that one study, I believe it was 66% of those that had been attacked had evidence of the attack in their logs, but it went totally unnoticed. So if you've got a monitoring and alerting solution in place that automates that, that's only going to help you.
Okay, great.
You know, and I know Microsoft Operations Manager can be a little pricey and a little tough to implement if you're a small business, but you know, again, it can be scripted through PowerShell, or there are freeware utilities out there that can do log aggregation and alerting for you.
Okay, super. Question from David, saying, how common is it to reset the domain admin password when IT staff leave the company? It clarifies, I feel like most SMBs are apprehensive to do this for fear of breaking something.
Yeah, you know, I've actually run into that in the real world. Organizations that have IT employees who knew the admin password leave and they didn't change it because they were afraid of breaking something. And what that really ties back to is, remember in the presentation I was talking about back in the old days, the way that service accounts were used so often, they were basically just accounts with elevated privileges. A lot of people, and this is terrible, but one of the practices that was relatively common back in the 90s was using a domain admin account as a service account. And so yes, if you go in and you change the password and that had been done, then you're going to break applications. But thankfully that hasn't been a practice for quite some time. So in most cases, I think you'll probably be fine going ahead and changing the domain admin password. But I think a better best practice than that even would be to make sure everybody has, or let me rephrase that, each member of the IT staff has two separate accounts, totally separate from the domain admin password. Write down the domain admin password, lock it in a safe somewhere. Nobody in IT should have it. Instead, each IT employee should have two accounts, one with administrative privileges and one with one with basic user privileges, so that way they can use their basic privileged account for anything that is not related to administrative responsibilities, like checking email, browsing the web, whatever. And they only use that admin account for things that require privileged access. So the advantage to that, not just from a security standpoint of not exposing an elevated account to a potential attack, but the other advantage is that when that user does perform an administrative task, the event logs are going to log that to a specific person rather than just saying this was done by administrator, who could be anybody.
That's really smart advice on both parts. You know, the auditing and logging capabilities, plus just not having people out there who aren't in your organization who know the domain password. Um, this last question comes from Peter. I love this question. I think it's a great one to go out on. Especially given your your 20x Microsoft MVP status and the fact that you write about Windows Server all the time. Peter wants to know, how do you feel Windows Server needs to change in the next decade?
Oh, wow. That is a great question. Um, I, I think that anything that Microsoft can do to shrink the operating system, reduce some complexity, and reduce the potential attack surface would be a good thing.
Hmm.
And I would actually say the same thing for desktop versions of Windows. I would absolutely love it if Microsoft would make a really low profile version of Windows 11 that doesn't, where they're not trying to monetize the start menu and have a million features that you don't need.
Right. Yeah. Okay, great. And David says thanks for the 2 account suggestions. He calls that excellent. But I think that's a great place to leave it. So, Brien, thank you so much for putting together a really informative presentation for us, and for all those that treasure map to those links, and for all your insights here in the Q&A. It's been a great session, and I really appreciate your time today. Thank you.
Thank you so much for having me. And thank you to everybody for all the questions and the nice comments.
All right, and as we wrap up, we have one more piece of business. It's the $300 Amazon gift card prize drawing. And the winner of the Amazon gift card today is Travis Yeo from Georgia. So congratulations to Travis. We'll be in touch to get you your card. And with that, on behalf of the Actual Tech Media team, I want to thank CrowdStrike for making this event possible. And if you enjoyed this webcast, I would like to call your attention to the next Expert Series session, which is coming up on Friday, May 20th. That one's about AI and ML and how those are transforming IT operations. It should be another good one, so don't miss it. And thanks as always for attending, and as Brien said, for your great questions and comments throughout. That concludes today's event. Happy Friday, and we hope to see you next time.